This is not a service, this is a celebration of Sandie's life. And I've got two problems in kicking off the memories for Sandie. The first problem is that many of you know me and know that if I reminisce about Sandie, then I lose my composure and dissolve into violent blubbing. So I'll do my best and apologize in advance if I fail. If I suddenly stop, it's because my throat fails. But you know that I'm a computer person and therefore I have a backup throat with me, which is my business partner, Merrill. And for over a quarter of a century now, we've been doing a double act where when I fail, she comes and takes over for me. So why should today be an exception? So if I suddenly stop talking and Merrill takes over, you'll know the reason. The second problem is that my first draft of the 52-and-a-half-year glorious memories of Sandie timed out at 17 hours. And there's another meeting in here tomorrow. So to be quicker and more efficient, of course I have to be selective. So I reflected on the fact that when I thought of the people who were coming, you all know quite a lot about Sandie for the last 10 or 20 or 30 years. But I decided to focus on the very early part of our relationship, which frankly nobody really knows. So let me tell you that early story. It was September 1964. I returned to my temporary home, which was a hall of residence at Manchester University. And when I got into the entrance hall, it was untypically crowded, and there was a sense of excitement around. Apparently, a new girl had joined the domestic staff, and you will understand the sense of excitement when I tell you the hall of residence was for 205 young men who had all gathered in the entrance hall, not all of them, but many of them, in order to get a look at the new prospect. Sandie made her entrance in the far wall on a staircase, and she came downstairs such that she appeared feet first. Within a few seconds, I was seeing a long pair of legs, which were inadequately covered by a 1960s miniskirt, which can be best described as a rather wide belt. So for me, it was lust at first sight, and for several dozen others in that entrance hall. But for me, it only took days to turn from lust into love as I finally got to see and know the top half of Sandie. For our first date, I took her to see Herman's Hermits. I'd seen this local band in Manchester before the summer break, but since then they had released their first single and had actually moved to top of the charts in the UK just a week before I invited Sandie to the dance. Pretty good timing, don't you think? Except you'd be wrong, because having reached the top of the charts, they had been booked by the university for £30 for the gig, about $60. And by the time we went to see them, they could get 10 times more at some other venue, so they didn't turn up. But we danced to other bands and we listened to Herman's record. And so despite the disappointment of their not showing, this became our song.
Woke up this morning feeling fine. There's something special on my mind. Last night I met a new girl in the neighborhood. Whoa, yeah. Something tells me I'm into something good.
And boy, was I into something good. We saw each other every day. Life in hall was good. Sandie's job was to supervise the cooks, the waitresses, and yes, we had waitress service, and the domestic staff, the housekeepers, and yes, we did get our beds made for us every day. So once it was known that I was the boyfriend of Sandie, which of course they'd come to love too, then I got all sorts of special treatment, the extra portions of the best food, and the other special treatments that made my student accommodation seem much more like a luxury hotel. Sandie and I danced a lot. 3 times a week we went to clubs to listen to live bands, and we gyrated and shook and twisted as dictated by the current fashions of so-called dancing. That was how we spent our time. And the early 60s were an exciting time in English pop music, and it gave us some special experiences that we always remembered a lot. because we got to see some of the biggest acts. The Kinks, for example. Who's heard of the Kinks? A few? Well, let's hear them.
Girl, you really got me going. You got me so I don't know what I'm doing. Yeah, you really got me now. You got me so.
She walked up to me and she asked me to dance. I asked her my name and in a dark brown voice she said Lola. Hello, hello, Lola.
Now who's heard of the Kinks? I'm prepared to wager that that's the first time that Lola's ever been played at a funeral. At the time, the Kinks had just had their third number one hit in the UK when the university booked them for a special occasion. And Sass and I were well-known groupies by this time, so we got backstage passes and actually sat on the grand piano on stage just behind them as they did their set and got to look out at the screaming people in the front. It's a bit like this afternoon, really. So who knows Steve Winwood? Again, with our backstage passes, we chatted with Steve Winwood between sets when he was just 16 years old and hadn't yet had a hit. Looking back, I'm embarrassed to remember that for someone who eventually got 6 platinum records and 7 gold records, Sandie and I patted him on the head and told him that he actually played guitar quite well and would probably be successful. You probably haven't heard of The Crazy World of Arthur Brown. Has anybody? Oh, we have one. Oh, of course. Rick will have heard of him. In fact, I'm sure Rick has based much of his life on him. But he did have a hit record on both sides of the pond, and this was it.
I am the god of hellfire, and I bring you fire. I'll take you to burn.
He promoted this song by wearing face paint that looked remarkably like Kiss, except 20 years earlier than Gene Simmons. And then he would put on a helmet that had horns coming out of the top of it, that was also covered in lighter fuel. He would then light it, get it, the song was called Fire, and he would dance round the stage maniacally waving his burning head. When we saw him, we were crammed against the front of a stage, and as he did his signature swinging his head round in circles, he came down and set Sandie's hair on fire. Good times, good times. You might say, why didn't we move back from the maniac? The simple answer is the 900 people behind us who were all pushing forward trying to get closer. In fact, that's why I have particularly overdeveloped triceps, because of the years I spent at these events holding on to the edge of the stage, which was typically this high, pushing back as hard as I could with my darling in here, trying to stop her from getting crushed, but usually failing. The music was also very loud. Saturday evening was the loudest, the biggest concerts. On Sunday I would ask Sandie, "Is it still with you?" And she would normally say yes. And then she'd say, "How about you?" And I would normally say yes. And then on Monday I'd say, "How about now?" And she'd say, "Yeah, a little bit." Of course, what we were talking about was the ringing in our ears from the music on Saturday night. That was the one concert we regretted when we went to see the Pretty Things. And we were, who's heard of the Pretty Things? Oh, Rick has, of course. And as usual, we were in the front row there, pinned against the stage, and this was the one time we regretted that, because there was no escape. And on that occasion, the ringing didn't leave us until Wednesday. We'd begun to wonder if it ever would. So when I have difficulty hearing you, now you understand why. It's not old age, it's the Pretty Things, and dozens of others. And so all I can say is, it was worth it. Would you like to hear the exact words I used to propose to Sandie? Listen carefully now. That was it. I never proposed to Sandie, nor she to me. After quite a short time, it just became obvious that we should be together as often as practical, for as long as practical, and forever. For either of us to have asked the other if we should spend our lives together would have seemed as silly as asking if the sun was going to rise tomorrow. But you know, the strongest love is just like an addiction. If I tell you that Sandie is my heroine, I mean that in both meanings of the word, with or without the E. But like all addictions, love can get you into trouble. Picture the hall of residence I mentioned. We both lived in it. And the main block had 3 young women who managed all these domestic affairs who were away from home for the first time. The other blocks had 205 men who were also away from home for the first time and whose hormones were raging. As you can imagine, therefore, sleepovers in either direction were not exactly encouraged. And they had, if discovered, rather severe penalties, which meant that the night that I was caught in Sandie's room meant that we were in trouble. The prescribed punishments is that I should be expelled from hall and Sandie would be fired from her job. But the judges who had to impose the sentence had known us for a year and seen us, and they knew that they were dealing with love. They were dealing with Romeo and Juliet, and who wants to have on their gravestone, "I expelled Romeo and fired Juliet." So we survived and got to stay exactly where we were, but we did have to promise solemnly that we would never do it again. And we kept that promise solemnly for almost 3 weeks. University life was great, and that's where we met and spent our first 2 years. But it had to come to an end. I got my dream job with IBM, but it meant going south, and we had to part for a while. At least that was what we bravely told each other. Phase 1 of the separation, remembering we'd been seeing each other just every day for 2 years, was my spending a few days at my parents' home to say goodbye to them. But on the 3rd day, there was a knock at the door. Unable to keep to the plan, Sandie had skipped work, got on a train and travelled hundreds of miles to get another fix. Having put Sandie back on a northern train, I started phase 2 of the separation by getting on a southern train to London, where I found a tiny apartment that I couldn't afford. But a few days later, there was a knock at the door. Unable to keep to the plan, Sandie had skipped work, got on a train, travelled 200 miles to get another fix. Can you see a pattern here? Sandie expected that she would only stay in London a few days, but we were talking on the first day, and she mentioned that her mother's neighbour, Mrs. Wakefield, had said to her, "If you're so miserable, why don't you two just get married?" So I thought for a bit and said, "Why didn't I think of that?" Sandie resigned her job and stayed in the tiny apartment while we went through the legalities of getting married as quickly as possible. In England, you have to do this in a register office, and you have to do it in the register office of the borough where you live, which in our case happened to be Hampstead Register Office. This was a problem. This register office, believe it or not, was very fashionable. The Beatles and the Rolling Stones had both had marriages there, and so hordes of people were moving into the borough and renting places just so they could get married in the Hampstead Register Office. So we had to accept the only slot available, which was 8 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday. We told our family of the plan and fully expected to be the only 2 people at the event. You can get professional witnesses who you hire on the way in, and there's usually a photographer outside to take a picture. So that was our wedding, except we were in the end amazed at the huge size of our wedding because 6 family members turned up, and so that was quite a day. Imagine wandering around Hampstead for 3 hours before you could get lunch after you got married. Just a few weeks later, Mrs. Manning and I were taking a Sunday stroll on beautiful Hampstead Heath when Sandie suddenly burst into tears. We'd only been together for a couple of years, but I'd already worked out that this was not a good sign. Apparently being married to me was everything she wanted, except for two things. First of all, she was missing her family and friends in Manchester, and secondly, she wanted a Yorkshire Terrier puppy. So I promised to take her back home and buy the puppy. This meant resigning from my dream job and starting again. But IBM surprised me by reassigning me to a job they specially invented in Liverpool and Manchester, so I kept my dream job for another 23 years. We took a train north together, rented a much nicer apartment, which we could barely afford, even though it was almost bare, having only a bed and 2 chairs. But being together we were happy, especially when our first child arrived. No, not Nina. This was Toggle, the promised Yorkshire Terrier. That's the story of our first 2.5 years together. As you can tell, if I were to continue through the other 50 to make 52.5 in total, we'd be here until Saturday. So as I step aside for others to remember Sandie, let me finish with a request. Please put me on a train that will take me to a door I can knock on and see her again.
I'm Keith's elder brother, and I've been somewhat appalled because I had no idea of what was going on all those years ago. The family have always loved Sandie. We've been very fortunate to have a sister-in-law who had grace, never knew a stranger, always cared and loved. Every time any member of the family had a birthday, Sandie was the only one that appeared with a card every single occasion. Every time a child was born, the cards came flowing in, and Sandie would make up for Keith's somewhat awkward social tendencies by her goodness and grace. And so the family and my brother, my other brother, and my sister both have asked me to express their feelings too, that all of us were the richer for knowing Sandie, were the better for knowing her grace and goodness, and for looking after my youngest, very feeble brother who mother had to desert at some point in life, but nevertheless made sure that he didn't waste away and is still as ornery as he ever was.
I started at KMA on 9/11/2001, and I went to the first Christmas party at the Mannings in December. And although I knew some of the people, I didn't know everybody. And I was next to this little lady, and I went over to her and I said, "Hi, I'm Tom." She said, "Well, I'm Sandie." I wasn't ready for that British accent. And I blamed it on all the crowd in the kitchen that I couldn't hear. So I asked her to say it again. She said, "I'm Sandie." And I still didn't understand it. Finally, she said, "It's Sandie in American." And she was so charming about it. I was embarrassed, of course, but she laughed and said, "That's okay." She remembered me from then on. Very nice lady, very charming. I only saw her once a year, but every time I saw her, she was so gracious.
My name's Jim Bunnell. I've only known Sandie as healthy and full of energy. I never saw her tired or unhappy or negative. To me, she was a balance of Keith. I hope I don't have to explain the issues we have with Keith. As a human being, I know my times with Sandie do not represent her reality. I didn't know her as sick. However, my memories are based upon enthusiasm and passion and balance to Keith. and love. I loved Sandie most when she was out in the world with her sister, Ann. Their collective sense of humor and energy and love were infectious. I loved to be around them when they were out there, discovering things. I was privileged to be around Keith and Sandie when they were building their home. The attention to detail is frightening. I was glazed over just listening to the detail, but I loved the passion. Sandie's energy towards her landscape, her garden, her decorations were something to behold. After the home was completed, Sandie was a gracious host every year. We looked forward to attending the events, even though we had to drive miles and miles to get there. Our distance forced less frequent encounters, and our lives started to separate based on geography and work. Unfortunately, sometimes this is how things happen. Sandie's memories for me are dominated by love of family. I know I don't need to mention the examples of her love of her family. I have no doubt that the grandchildren know how much they were loved. Love is the essence of Sandie. It was her. If you require proof of that love, I'll just mention two names, Roxy and Tootsie. If you didn't know that, this is an example of those two dogs. She loved unconditionally, and it's a domination of my memory of her. An unknown author said, "We are lent into each other's keeping. Our time with each other is borrowed, its duration unknown, and that uncertainty makes it precious." The last quote from C.S. Lewis, "We meet no ordinary people."
Hi, everybody. My name is Jocelyn, and I had the great pleasure of living next door to the Mannings for just about 18 years in Cooper Sandie, wonderful neighborhood. I've got some small notes on my phone, and of course I don't have my reading glasses with me, so I don't think I can compare in my delivery of speech to the English gentleman here, but I'm going to try. My very first memory of Sandie is when I had just moved in. My husband, Jim, and I had Catherine, who had just turned a year old. And I put Catherine down for a nap, much to my relief, so I could get some things done. But like Sandie, my first passion was always to go out and garden. To heck with the house, at my house. That was never to heck with the house at the Mannings. It was always neat as a pin. Whenever I went over there, God, she did it again. She's got me beaten in the yard and beaten in the house, right? So I'm out there puttering in the garden. I'm thinking, this is great. It's really my first week in the house. My daughter's having a nap. And I hear this sort of scrambling next door at the Mannings, and I hadn't really met Keith and Sandie yet. And I looked over and I caught a flash of very bright pink, which is Sandie, right? And I look over and I think, oh, there's a beautiful plant over there. What is that? And Sandie emerges around the side of the house. And I waved to her and she waved to me and she called out, "Hello!" And I thought, what? Again, back to the accent. And she introduced herself and I thought she said Cindy. And I said, "Oh, nice to meet you, Cindy. It's Sandie, Cooper Sandie." So that was the start of our wonderful relationship over almost 2 decades. I have a lot of memories that my children wanted me to share because they loved her so much. They love Keith too, but some favorites are Halloween. Sandie and Keith always gave out the best Halloween candy, little packets that Sandie would put together with plastic bags and a ribbon with a pencil and a tattoo or some wonderful silly putty and maybe a piece of candy, to their great delight. It was always the first stop for us on Halloween. Secondly, and probably most importantly, was Christmas. The decorations outside. So Catherine would wait every night as it got to December with her face pressed against her upstairs bedroom window, craning her head to look at the Mannings' yard for the beloved angel to arrive. And I know everybody here who's been to the Mannings company Christmas parties knows what I'm talking about. At one point, the beloved angel was absconded with, and we were all very upset. I literally drove around all of Alpharetta looking for that angel. I was ready to knock on doors. But really, I think Sandie is probably the most gentle, nicest, kindest woman I've ever had the pleasure and honor of knowing. We would just constantly run into each other, out at the mailbox usually, and we would get into heated discussions about politics occasionally because we didn't always agree on things, but it was never a negative thing between us. We became great friends. She was just a constant in our lives, and I will miss her. I had the great privilege of Sandie and Keith trusting me to take care of Sandie at the beginning of her illness. And we had wonderful times. Some of the photos were up on the marquee out there, but I would pop her in my VW Bug, and we'd put Toby on her lap, and I'd have Barley on my lap, and we'd go to North Park, and we'd take our walks. And at that point, Sandie wasn't able to really talk much, so of course I could chatter. That was one thing we had in common. We just chatted, and I chatted away for both of us, and we had a wonderful time. Go to Home Depot, put Toby in the shopping cart. You're listening to me, Toby. I just never, ever saw her in a bad mood. I never saw her ever in a bad mood or an unkind word, and I will miss her greatly, but I just feel privileged to have been part of her life and to have known her. So, thank you.
I'm Anella, and I was one of the night nurses in Sandie's team. Marvi, Sheila, Sonny, Carmen, Allison, and Rose, and Joe, he's not here, but we were a couple years now with Sandie. Some of us less, some of us a little bit more. Unfortunately, we didn't know Sandie before the illness, but I think in our eyes, for us, she was never sick, at least not for me, because that's how I knew her. And even if she never talked to us, we actually never did much with her, but just sitting there watching TV with her, showing her pictures, just giving her a bath, putting nice clothes on her. I think we all of us enjoyed that time with her. And we definitely gonna miss her, and we loved her so much. Thank you.
It's a cliche, but would you all stand up? You're angels. Please, all stand up.
Hi, I'm Nevin. Contrary to a popular belief with Gramps and recently as of late my mother, my name isn't Simon. We're different people. We look different. Just please. Yeah. I don't understand the confusion. I would also like to apologize for the pictures in the previous room. I seem to have had an obsession with bright orange and red in my youth. I don't really understand it, and I didn't quite know how to comb my hair until about a year ago, so hopefully you didn't pay too much attention to those. My earliest memory of my grandmother, or Nana as me and my sibling Quinn referred to as, I must have been about 3 or 4 while my lovely mother, was working at KMA. I attended daycare with several other employees' children. Nana would come to pick me up each day, and I remember always looking forward to this little tin she kept, this little jelly bean tin filled with marshmallows or other treats, and I always loved spending that time with her. If I had one regret, it would probably be not saving all the cards she sent. Just something with her handwriting on it I'd really love to have, but I loved her so much, and she really loved us, and I'm just so sad she's not here, but I'm happy I got to spend so much time with her.
I'm Liz, former employee of KMA1. I know many of you here. And one of the descriptives that Sandie's brother-in-law mentioned earlier was that Sandie never knew a stranger. I'm that stranger. I'm one of those people that is genuinely uncomfortable in large crowds, and I would always hesitate accepting an invitation to Sandie and Keith's home or even to Merrill's home, but somehow I would force myself to do it. And the first time I did it, when it came to going to a lovely KMA1 event at the Manning's home, I was in dread. I walked up to the door, forced myself to ring that bell, and the person who answered that door was Sandie, who I had never met before. And the feeling that I felt right from that very moment was this incredible, genuine warmth and loving person. And she greeted me, she hugged me, and I was just astounded. And I said to myself, wow, I think I'm ready to meet the next person. She has just made me feel so warm and accepted. So she, in my mind, after that first meeting, was the consummate hostess, which I'm not. I forget to put forks and spoons out when I'm doing an event, and that's something Sandie would never forget. So I thank you. Thank you, Sandie.
I have to fill in this part of her life, the Ashford part. They were one of the original owners in Ashford, and I came about a year and a half afterwards, and I love that British accent. I just love this lady. She's so much fun, and the family was great, and we were animal lovers and all that kind of good stuff. And talking about Sandie and food and preparation and all that goes into having good parties and that, well, we talked her into the women's club, which was just newly organized, and she was in charge of the clubhouse and the rental of the clubhouse. And I'll tell you that when we rented it out, we had rules. You have to present it this way when you're all done with it. It's never to her satisfaction. Why didn't they clean that? Why didn't they do that? It had to be perfect, and she made it that way. She was just a great person to have around. There was another memory, but I can't remember. I do have, I think, a memory. We have Beth and Sandie and another gal and I, we always got together and celebrated our birthdays. And when Ann came, it was a great time. We had wonderful times. We'd go down to the botanical garden, and we'd gone to a play. She organized plays for the neighborhood. We missed her. I missed her especially at Ashford, and so had a track up this way and got to visit and stay with her for a while too. So Sandie was a memorable person.
My name is Merrill, Keith's business partner. My throat doesn't always cooperate, and I don't have a backup. So thank you all for all your kind words for this lovely lady. I've known Sandie as almost as long as I've known Keith, for 30-something years. And when I was always in awe of Sandie's crafty creativity. That's something that hasn't been mentioned much today, but I mean, she had to have it to decorate that house as beautifully as she did. But one of the first times I met her, she was actually working on a project at home, making holiday decorations in her craft room. She was doing a toll painting, or Southern Rustic Crafts, I think it was called. And I understand this came about from hopping around the holiday craft fairs with Jeannie. So they'd go to all the, the Marist craft fairs and all this at the holiday time. And apparently Sandie saw some really nice 6-foot Santas that were gorgeous, and so I think she bought one and brought it home to Keith. But she and Jeannie said, I can make those. So over the next few years, she made a bunch of them. Keith would cut the wood. It was rustic wood it was made out of, and Sandie would paint them and decorate them. And I think there was one time where they even made a road trip to Greenwich, Connecticut. And the story is they sold them for like 2 to 3 times more than the Southerners would pay. Because this was the rustic painting from the South. So, and now many of you KMAers and spouses, etc., have attended the many pumpkin carving and holiday craft nights we would have at KMA. And Sandie would always attend, and it appeared that I was put on Sandie and Keith's team because we were kind of in charge, and I would run around as if I had all sorts of other responsibilities, meanwhile leaving Sandie and maybe Ann, if she was visiting, to kind of decide on the holiday theme for the gingerbread house, you know, what we would do for it, or maybe the sweatshirt, what design we'd put on there. And so I was looking very busy, but I was actually hoping she'd come up with a winning design for that, the gingerbread house, or indeed one of the pretty designs for the sweatshirts that she would make that I could then just copy. So I would just take advantage of her creativity, and so that's some of the things that I remember about Sandie. I did get a couple of tributes that I wanted to read out. One is from a good friend of ours we called Stevie. Her name was Stephanie Standridge, and she wrote, "My memories of Sandie are many and always filled with happiness. Her kindness to me came in ways too numerous to list. When I was in a new state with no family, she and Keith adopted me into theirs. Sandie invited me over to share an English Christmas, complete with poppers and high tea at 4 p.m. She trusted me to care for her beautiful home, her dogs Tootsie and Rosie, and her flowers when she and Keith traveled. I seem to remember a couple of ducks she named Albert and Victoria as well. When I moved into my first apartment, she took me to her attic of treasures and gave me lamps, side tables, and chairs, all of which still reside in my home in New York today. Sandie, you are in a class most of us can only hope to attain, and we are all lucky we had the privilege to know you. My heart is with your loving family." I have one cute one, and we'll leave it to somebody to try and know if this is one of their relatives. This young lady says, "I remember Sandie fondly from my childhood spent at KMA events. She always had a beautiful smile, and I remember loving the way she spoke so softly and proper. Anya and I would try to mimic her whenever she walked away, and we knew she couldn't hear us." This last one, I think, is from good friends of Sandie and Keith's, Suzanne and John Sweat. They currently live in Florida, but they say, "We met Sandie and Keith in England when we were all years younger than our children are now. We became friends, as often parents do, through the childhood school friendships of Nina and our daughter Lauren. The Manning family became our unofficial English hosts, and though we didn't know it then, our lifelong friends. In the last 3 years, I've revisited many memories from Farnham Common, chats over milky coffee and homemade cookies with children playing in the manicured gardens, the walks through Burnham beaches, with the Yorkies contrasting markedly with our golden lab. Sandie turning pineapple, ham, toothpicks, foil, and half of some fruit into a hedgehog for a children's birthday. Conferencing over a name for a fledgling school newspaper they started, attending the village school field day and celebrating the school's 100-year history with costumes. A few years later, we were all back in the U.S. and continued the friendship that gives me more shared memories of our special family connections, her enthusiasm for planning KMA events, her preference for desserts over lettuce and tomatoes, her joy on trips to Kiowa and Destin, her vibrancy and beauty the day Nina was married, her delight in speaking of the grandchildren, her pride in Simon's accomplishments. John and I send condolences to her friends, neighbors, and caretakers who cared for Sandie as we do. We send love to Keith, Nina, and her family, Simon and Ann.
Hi, I'm Kevin McKenna, and in listening to all your stories, I didn't even know I had one until I listened to everyone else's, and it just came to me. But every Friday night for years, and I don't even know how many years I'm talking about, but at least 2 or 3, Sandie, Keith, Marilyn, and I would meet for dinner every Friday night, same restaurant, same time. You know, it sounds boring, but, you know, in thinking about it, it wasn't. I looked forward to going every Friday night, and as usual, Sandie and I would be on time. Keith and Merrill would be late. So, not even knowing it was happening, Sandie and I would have our moments, our short time together every Friday night. And, Keith and Merrill would arrive at some point, and, then we'd go on with what we were there for. But, just sitting here listening, I just realized, it's something I miss. And Merrill and I have started the same thing. We go out every Friday night now, same restaurant, same time. And, I didn't know why we were doing it, but, I'm thinking, it's a tradition we had with Sandie that, we just wanted to carry on. And, I guess I did miss doing that and still do.
It was the bit before we arrived that we really enjoyed, though.
Hello, I'm Duncan Gould. I'm a little nervous. If anyone's ever been to a KMA event, there's a lot of guidelines around these. And I received the guidelines just as I arrived, and normally there's a video too, and I didn't see that either. So I'm going to apologize to Keith in advance because I'm sure I'm going to violate some of the guidelines with my speech. It's an honor and a privilege to be here and celebrate the life of Sandie. There are some people that have the gift of bringing joy to people, and I don't mean a conscious effort of trying to make people joyful. It's more of an aura, and Sandie had that. All you had to do was see her, and you could feel joy rise up in you. And over the years at KMA and the KMA events, I saw her effect on many people, which you've heard other people talk about today. Call it class, dignity, properness, or whatever words you would like to describe Sandie. She was all that and more. She had a smile for everyone, but never a cross word. Sandie is and will be greatly missed. My deepest condolences to Sandie's family and friends. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Maureen, and I don't know if I can get through this. I had the pleasure of being part of the KMA family through my husband, who worked for KMA. And I had never been part of an organization that was so giving and caring for its employees. The parties twice a year where Sandie would open her home graciously and be there to greet all of us and make us feel such a part of their lives, I marveled. But I especially remember Sandie and Keith because of their graciousness to my mother, who came to live with us. And they always included her in the parties that we were offered at Christmas, I always say 12th night, and our fall festival. And for that, I just am so grateful. My mom would come back home and she'd say, they didn't have to invite me. They didn't have, and I say, I know, Mom, but that's who they are. And I have one funny story, and I don't remember the name of the duck, but one of our youngest granddaughter was at one of the fall festivals, and the duck came out of the pond, and she went to feed the duck, and the duck nipped at her. And Sandie was so solicitous because she was concerned. Of course, nothing was wrong, but that was Sandie. She was gracious. And I have to say one thing. Christmas time at their home, I would walk around, and every nook and cranny in that home had something for you to see. I didn't know how long it took her to put it up. I didn't want to know because I couldn't have done it. And the thought of taking it down was even harder for me to imagine. But we were blessed. We were very blessed to have them in our lives. Thank you.
My name's Jim Trier. I've worked at KMA since 1995, and I was just thinking the other day, what a wonderful, warm, and gracious person Sandie was. And as I look through pictures of my 3 daughters who were basically raised at KMA, so many of the pictures are KMA events and functions. And hearing you all reminisce, so much of the standard for graciousness that my girls were raised to look up to is Sandie. She'll be greatly missed. I have 3 daughters that are all Anglophiles, and they watch Pride and Prejudice every year, which you brought those videos in, I remember. We watch it as a family, and we have a tea set, and it's just so. She was such a part of our lives that her memory will live on forever. So thank you.
I was fortunate to get to know Sandie probably in 1991 when I started dating her daughter. And, I was a painter and I started going to college and all this, and Nina wanted me to meet her mom. So I come to the house in Ashford, and I know some of you will remember in that house it had a barrel vaulted ceiling in it. And Sandie, trying to figure out if I knew what I was talking about, I told her I was a painter originally, and she says, well, I need somebody to paint this barrel vault in my dining room. Can you do that for me? You can imagine, after looking around at the house and thinking, here's some guy from the South, a redneck, I'm going to paint her ceiling. So I get in there, and the whole time, and I want to impress her because I wanted to keep dating her daughter. And so I'm sitting here trying to paint, and the whole time I could kind of feel her watching me, and I'm sitting here painting this ceiling, and my hands were shaking, and I had a little napkin I was wiping any excess around the corners. And finally got done, and and she was happy. But I have to say, she, over the years, as most people think, son-in-laws and mother-in-laws never get along and all that, but she was not like that. She was the nicest person. And she's been so good to me and Nina and the kids. And I can remember when Nevin was born, she came over for like a week and stayed at our house. And, as anybody that's been to our house, it knows that we're not the cleanest people in the world. But Sandie came, and in one day, she literally cleaned that whole house up while I was at work. And I came home, and the house was spotless. And she just treated me and my kids and Nina and all us so well, and it's a testament to the person that she was. She went out of her way, and the best word I can think of is consideration of other people. And that really struck me as something I was honored to be a part of her life and Keith's life, and Nina and Simon and Ann. And I see it too with the cards. Ann's the same way. She gives cards every time. A lot of other people forget about this, but when somebody thinks about you and does these things continuously, that lets you know that those people are thinking about you. That thought is what makes a difference in everybody's life. When you see that, I was just thankful to be a part of her life and to be a part of the Manning family. And I was just glad I did a good job on that paint job.
Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for helping us celebrate her life. Let's meet again sometime, just the way we've done over the years, whether it's in small groups, having dinners at the collection, whether it's Christmas parties, and let's make sure we include the new members of our family, the nurses. Thank you so much.